Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. WitchLit is brought to you by 1000 Volt Press, a family-owned independent publisher established to produce the books we want to see in the world. Titles including Changing Past by Yvonne Abarrow, Conjuring the Commonplace by Lane Fuller and Corey Thomas Hutchison, and my latest book, Verona Green, can be purchased directly from 1000voltpress.com or wherever you buy books. And Cichon is living his best digital nomad life, making friends with places, plants, and mythic beings all across the United States. He's from Buffalo, New York originally, and is braving the American South because he despises winter with the fury of 1,000 suns. He has years of experience working in nonprofits, trying to make the world a less shitty place, and he has unnecessarily expensive degrees in photography and international relations, of all things. In a former life, he wanted to be a photographer for National Geographic. Now he gets to be a traveling wizard collaborating with stories that play back. Seems like he got a decent deal in the end. I'd agree. His first book is The Mad Habitatter, Wild Gods in Richmond. Ed Cichon, welcome to WitchLit.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for reaching out, which is a good reminder to folks that you can contact me if you want to be on the show. So I'm excited to talk about your book and kind of your experience as a digital nomad. So that'll be a fun topic. But our first question for everybody is, especially, in this age of social media and craziness and YouTube and all that, why write? Why still write books?
I think there's a whole lot of reasons why I gravitate towards writing in particular and like books secondarily. And so I feel like skill is a certain thing where I just love to write. Certainly something that I try not to suck at. And, due to a lot of practice over the years, it's something that I've just tried to really lean into as much as I can. But also I am really interested in fiction and stories from a magical witchcraft kind of perspective. And I feel like there's so much to be had incorporating that kind of sort of stuff into your magical practice. And my book really is a bit of a really leveling up for me in terms of what my magical practice looked like beforehand. Now creative writing and writing about spirits and gods and mythic beings and stuff really has transformed the way I interact as a witch, wizard, animist, whatever we want to call myself. But I feel like that really has been a major factor for me over the last year and a half. And so it's become quite a major deal for me, which I'm quite excited to kind of feature with work-wise and just for the most part, trying to incorporate it, practice-wise as much as I can. But it really is just something that I love to do. And it's just also a really nice little magical toolbox to magical tool to have in your toolbox, I guess.
Yeah. So you self-published the book. So do you want to talk about kind of that, I guess, journey, decision, what that process was like for you? Because I feel like it's one thing to write a book. It's a whole different thing to publish a book yourself.
Speaking of magical toolboxes, I guess, I have decent amount of experience in writing, also graphic design, photography, and I'm fairly tech savvy for the most part. And so I had all these things in my back pocket in terms of skills that I've had because of, my job in nonprofits and other specific things that I've worked on. And I figured if I can do it myself, why bother trying to work with a publisher if I can try it myself? A lot of it also came down to the fact that this particular story that I wanted to tell was kind of time sensitive and I wanted to kind of have it out as soon as possible. And so I could have gone through the whole publishing process, but that would have taken a good long while. But the story itself seemed to really kind of want its way out as quickly as possible. And so self-publishing really kind of seemed like a quick and quick way, I suppose, to get it done. And it was quick. I learned a lot throughout the process and trying to just figure out all the different things in terms of setting a book and trying to work on spacing and cover design, using tools and things like that for that kind of sort of stuff. And it was, a lot of learning. But if you already have those kind of tools in your back pocket, I suppose, it's something it's easy to lean into and it's easy to learn-ish if you just have the patience. Mm-hmm. And also for the most part, marketing and graphic design, web design, all that kind of sort of stuff too. So it just gave me a nice little project to work on. The marketing part is definitely the hardest part about the whole self-publishing process. I'm sure you've had people talk about that before who've gone through this process. That is why I'm here today, because trying to make the marketing thing happen for myself. But that's by far the most challenging aspect of the whole thing. I can do the graphic design, do the title cover design, do the writing itself, marketing is where is the rubber meets the road, I suppose.
Yeah. Marketing is my personal ninth circle of hell. I just don't enjoy marketing. I don't enjoy flogging myself. I'm happy to flog other people's stuff. I don't like flogging myself. So that is just hard. Again, I agree. I was curious. So did you work with anybody else on the book? Did you work with the editor or anybody? Or did you really just do everything yourself?
I did it all on my own. I thought about working with an editor and just getting like somebody to just kind of like breeze through it a couple times. But again, it just felt very, for lack of a better word, time sensitive. Really wanted to get out over the summer. Not that, got a heck of a lot of attention at that time, but it seems like there is a specific motivation to having the spirit out of the book as soon as possible. And so I just felt like I'd take a shot at it and see how it went. And so it was all me for the most part.
Yeah. So for folks who haven't read it, do you want to kind of give I guess the story of the book in a synopsis with no spoilers?
So it is about, it's a semi-autobiographical tale of what I experienced living in the city of Richmond, Virginia in the fall of 2022. And so I experienced a series of synchronicities that were just kind of off the wall and bonkers. And they were so ridiculous at points that I really just started to kind of write things down because I just couldn't believe them. And my whole goal was like, if I ever were to tell this story to somebody else or like write it down or whatever, I'd have to have this all documented. And I'll kind of like, this whole thing came out of my notes app on my phone originally as me trying to just like document all the ridiculous things happening. But what was the fun thing about it is that it ties in with specific spirits of place and mythic beings and stuff in Western history and things along those lines that then kind of like interact with each other and interact with the Richmond area while I was there. So it just kind of documents my experiences for the most part, meeting wild gods, for lack of a better description, out wandering around Richmond and wandering around the river there. Love the James River. Shout out to the James River, I suppose. And so it's pretty much just me telling that story as succinctly as possible with interactions with the spirits and stuff around me.
Mm-hmm. So I was thinking about this reading your book and knowing that you move around and just as an animist and like a person who is into kind of spirits of place, like what is that like when you kind of have this digital nomad life to like, what is it? How do you connect when you get somewhere new? Like, what do you do?
I am a huge hiker. And I would say that I would not be doing this well if not for hiking. It is a very lonely life in a lot of ways because it's just me moving from city to city. All my family, for the most part, is back home, trying to make friends wherever possible. But making friends as an adult in America is not an easy process, unfortunately. I'm sure lots of folks kind of can sympathize with that. Yeah. But what's fun is thanks to the animist perspective that I have, my brain and, my soul, spirit, whatever, I'm not sure how to label that quite well, really do tend to find spirits of place, animals, plants, and those kind of things as like friends. So I get like legit excited when I can start documenting and identifying plants out in the wild when I'm out hiking around parks and stuff. I see roses and I get super excited. I see raspberries, I get very excited. Loblolly pines are the best thing about living in Durham right now. So I make friends with these specific beings wherever I am. And I love that practice. And that is a huge part of my journey. And it's been a really fun aspect of just moving from place to place. It's really learning to identify plants and rivers, bodies of water, all those kind of sort of things that I gravitate to, and just learning their personalities and quirks and trying to find more about their histories, what brought them to the specific place that they're in, all that kind of sort of great stuff. So it really is quite a fun little animist practice. But it's also a little dislocating in the sense that I do miss having one specific spot that I can kind of like really dig into and do well with. It's just constant new friends all the time, but it's not always developing those long-term relationships because I do move around so much that it's kind of hard to make that work. But it is, double-edged sword sort of thing. But for the most part, it's a really cool thing to have so many plant friends and animal friends and stuff like that, and spirits of place friends now all across the eastern part of the United States.
Do you find like when you come back to places that it's easier now to kind of step back into those relationships? Or have you not made enough of the same turns yet to have that experience?
I haven't done a lot of returns. Durham's like the first. No, I say I was just in Asheville for 3 months, and I was back in Asheville after not having the best time when I was there in the fall of 2021, only because I didn't realize there was a peak Asheville time. I didn't realize that like late October is just like the time that everybody floods to Asheville, North Carolina because of the leaves. And so I was there in the fall of 2021 during that time. And it's an amazing city, but it was so busy that I couldn't do much but the stuff that I typically would want to do, because downtown was insanely packed and just people were everywhere. And so all the stuff I was hoping to do, I couldn't do because it was just so busy. So I got back to Asheville and spent part of the summer, the early fall there, which was lovely, had the best time. And it did feel like redemptive, for lack of a better word, I guess, when I got there, just because it felt so much looser, so much freer, so many more things that I had access to. I was able to go hiking a lot easier. I just had the best time. I love Asheville. And then coming back to Durham, I love Durham, but Durham doesn't like me. And so it's really kind of interesting to have that confirmed coming back here as a second time. The first time, my day job exploded when I was here in December of 2021 is when it was. I was working 60 hours a week, just doing all this stuff to get a project done. It was kind of bonkers for quite a while. And then coming back to Durham this time, I decided to kill my car the night before my move here. So it was a very stressful experience. So it's been a rough few weeks, but I do like Durham as a city. It just doesn't seem to like me. But it's fun to kind of have that perspective around understanding certain cities. As much as I appreciate them, they just might not like me for whatever reason, because they have their own agency too.
Yeah. I don't know. It's always interesting to me. Like I haven't lived a whole lot of other places. Usually if I move, I'm there for a while. But I have lived a few places and I've traveled a lot. And it's always interesting to me, like when you get to somewhere new, and even if you've never been there before and you have that feeling of, I know this place, or it like a welcoming kind of, that's really different than you get somewhere and everything is overwhelming. Or like I wanted to love New York. I don't. I love what New York has to offer. The city itself exhausts me. But London, you would think would be exhausting in the same way. Never had that experience there. Like I love it. I feel energized by the city, and it's huge and big like that. But I think it's also a scale issue with those two places. Like London is much more human scale in a lot of ways than New York.
I don't know if you're anything like me. I also, and caveat/bias here, most people born in upstate New York, like I was, I'm from Buffalo originally, also are not big fans of the city. And so I've been to New York a few times. It's not my favorite place in the world either. I vastly prefer London also. London is my favorite city. And so I definitely agree with the human scale thing. My issue too with New York in a lot of ways, I know that there are pockets where this isn't the case, but New York feels to me just like concrete block after concrete block, whereas London tends to have more green space kind of interspersed throughout the city for the most part. And I just love like the twists and turns that London tends to have. New York is very rigid for understandable and obvious reasons, I think, in terms of how it was created over time. And that kind of goes back to the whole interesting twist on the whole spirits of place. And I believe both of those cities, again, have their own kind of sort of agency and, spirit to themselves too. Yeah. New York is much more rigid. And I feel like London has a bit more of a old style playfulness to it. Not that, New York doesn't have a playfulness to it, or not that London isn't rigid at times either, but they tend to have their own personality, certainly.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I, having now moved to the West Coast, and I will probably lose my nascent Californian card, but I also, though I love what San Francisco has to offer, the city kind of overwhelms me and gives me agita when I'm there. I don't like driving up a street and only seeing sky. It's a weird perspective issue for me. Like where does this road go kind of thing. I don't know. I absolutely don't drive in San Francisco if I don't have to. My husband usually drives when we're there because it's almost like having vertigo in the car.
Sounds a little dangerous and also not exactly fun. So I can see you.
No. So, but yeah, again, I love what it has to offer. Like I love like going into San Francisco to have dinner or something like that. Like the city itself just feels almost claustrophobic, maybe.
Have you been there, or had you been there prior to like the last 15 years? Because maybe it just changed recently. Did you have that certain reaction to it before? I wondered about that
because I went the first time I went to San Francisco was like in the late 90s when I was in grad school, and I didn't stay in the city for very long. Like I met someone, and then we did like a road trip through Northern California. So I had like a very limited experience, but like my experience that time was just walking everywhere in San Francisco and at night. And I liked that part of San Francisco more than like daytime business hour San Francisco, I guess. So yeah. And I mean, we've done a couple things. Like we've gone, we did one of those like nighttime museum things at the Science Museum in Golden Gate Park. And that was really cool because it was at night. It was, adults in the Science Museum. So that was really cool. And then went and had burritos in the Mission. And I think there's something about the darkness in San Francisco that makes it more human. I don't know. Maybe it's just a city that's alive at night. I don't know.
That I was just going to say that. So I feel like there is definitely a lot of cities that have very distinct personalities between daytime version and nighttime version, right? And like Summit is not that big of a deal. And even just like, not even just nightlife, but just the visceral experience of the city at night can be a completely different experience depending on where you are. And sometimes much more fun and just like much more loose or interesting or engaging. And yeah, I can see that being part of the appeal of maybe walking around San Francisco at night too. I was there a couple times when I was younger and I loved it when I was like in my teens. And I think the last time that I was there was when I was 17. We went twice when I was way younger, but I haven't been back since the whole tech bro takeover. And I don't think it would be for me now for obvious reasons. And so I feel like it's changed quite a bit.
It's definitely different. And I have to say, and this will definitely lose me my Bay Area card, I really kind of prefer San Jose. Like it feels a lot more lived in. Like it just feels like a I don't know. There's just something about San Jose. I'm really enjoying being here. And like I love our neighborhood. And, it's just a very different place. And I mean, there's been other places around the Bay I really like, but yeah, it's an interesting place. And, every little town between, kind of around the Bay, all those little places between Oakland and San Jose and San Francisco all have their own little flavor and personality. Like it's not just one piece in any way, shape, or form. So
what's been maybe like your reaction to or interpretation of like the spirit of place of the whole, and not Bay Area as a whole is probably too difficult, but as like San Jose maybe have a specific spirit of place that you tend to interact with or experience that jumps out?
I think so. And I think part of it is the mountains because we're so close where we are in San Jose, because we're in like the northeast part of the city. So we're really close to the mountains. And like it reminds me of home a lot because, I grew up in East Tennessee with the Appalachians right there. And though these mountains look very different because they're not covered in trees, but they have that same softness to them that the Appalachians have. So I think it feels probably more like home in some ways. It has that kind of mountainous, but not the Rocky Mountain kind of, like that tall above the tree line. It doesn't have that feel. Like those are very different mountains. They're a lot less approachable, I guess, than, kind of the Appalachians and these intercoastal mountains here. So
I feel like I definitely get the vibe of the different types of mountains. I was in Geneva for a couple of months in grad school, and so the Alps, I think, were in.
The Alps are a whole different. They got a whole different vibe.
Absurd. They're like majestic and very unapproachable is the good word for them, I guess. I'm going to steal your approachable word. Whereas like the Appalachians, extremely approachable, and I feel like are way more, for lack of a better word, interested in humans. Because I think they're much more hospitable to us. They're more willing to like work with us and partner with us. Where like the Alps are just like not much interest in helping you live here at all whatsoever for obvious reasons. But I feel like there is a very difference of personality between mountain ranges, even, which is always fun to see and witness.
Yeah. I mean, Appalachians have a darkness to you, but I haven't experienced that here as much. But I feel like Appalachia is more approachable, but there's also like they have a spooky vibe. I don't know how else to say it. They just have a spooky vibe too. So, which,
spooky, smoky vibe, I would go with.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily like a bad thing. Like I kind of like that about Appalachia. I'll plug Old Gods of Appalachia podcast for them. Like the excellent way in if you're not Appalachian or aren't familiar with this mountain. Their stories are great. But yeah, it's interesting to me, and how that, to kind of get back to the writing aspect, I guess, how where you are influences your writing. Like, I think about, like, sometimes it's easier to write about home when you're kind of in exile than when you're there, like the perspectives.
That's right. Even like just in terms of writing practice for me, I have to go somewhere else to write, and just removing myself from the day-to-day existence of the same place I spent all my time in. I have to leave. I've tried it a couple of times, and it depends on the place that I'm living in. Like, I had a really easy time writing at home when I was in St. Petersburg. Haven't been able to do it at all in Durham. I have to leave the house here in Durham to go to a coffee shop. And so if I don't do that, it just doesn't happen. And so it's interesting to me to kind of see like that whole, it really does depend on the specific house that you're living in, the specific place that you're living in, the city that you're living in, all that kind of sort of thing. And that all does influence how you write and what you end up writing about. My stuff tends to be very also very surroundings based to me too. So I'll just pull in things from like the coffee shop or whatever and kind of like go off on a quick short story just to kind of like get my feet wet with things along those lines. And those tend to really be influential. And if I can find one small, cool little interesting tidbit of information or like inspiration sort of piece, I can go for 3 hours just on a new tie-in sort of story, I guess. And I've done a lot of short stories and stuff on that are interestingly influenced by drinks at coffee shops. And so I have one specifically written about the pink drink at Starbucks when I first found out about that. That was just delicious. I went into this whole story about strawberries and witches and stuff. And then I have one about tea and meeting the spirit of death when I was in St. Petersburg. So just small little things that you wouldn't even think that could like spur a really cool story about mythic beings and stuff tie really in easily, I suppose, with the inspiration and stuff you find anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was like, one of the things, and I've talked about this a lot on the show, so people who've listened for a while will know my lament about COVID really changing my writing, because I used to write all day in a coffee house, and I still don't quite feel comfortable doing that inside right now. So I miss that. But one of the things about coffee houses that I've tried to recreate at home is there's something about that level of human generated white noise that, whatever it is, that feeds my brain in a way that I can't quite capture. Like, I've tried the YouTube videos and they help in it a little bit, but it's not, there's something about those sounds and knowing that you're surrounded by other people, but you're not in their, you're not in their space in the same way. It's just, I don't know. That's really one of those things. I also can't get distracted by the fact that I need to do laundry or whatever. All of the things where
laundry is always a killer in terms of productivity, which is sad.
Like, oh, I could go alphabetize the pantry, or I could write, like, which I wonder, like, for you moving around a lot, there are definitely, domestic chores, but it's not the same as like being in a place and having that same cycle of domestic stuff. So does that make it easier too, or does it not matter?
I don't think it matters too much for me, which is nice. I work from home, so I can like tackle some of the chore stuff pretty easily. But I'm also extremely minimalist in terms of all the stuff that I own. So I have everything that I own for the most part fits in my car. And so I don't have a lot of things to move around, and I find furnished apartments and those kind of sort of things too. But I don't think it really matters too much in terms of like having to be, I get distracted by things like video games and podcasts and Instagram very, very easily. And that's what that's why removing myself from this specific place where those things are easily accessible tends to make things easier for me. Yeah. But the household stuff, again, because I don't have a lot of things, there's not a lot for me to kind of keep on top of in terms of just stuff to do. That makes it easy.
Yeah. I wonder now, like, about being in, like, because furnished apartments always have personalities. Like, have you noticed that, like, in your moving around, like, some places just feel a little more human and some places feel kind of plastic and weird?
What's been interesting too is like the reason why I'm on this journey in a lot of ways came from an apartment my last apartment in Buffalo, that the description I would use to describe her, and it was very clear, it was a very a gendered woman kind of sort of thing, very harsh, like English school sort of principal kind of sort of person who was very, very stern and extremely And either went to be very mean and like very incorrigible and harsh, or would drive you to do the coolest thing you've ever done. And so thankfully, when I moved in, I felt this like very strong presence of that specific thing. And I'm like, I'm going to hate living here for the next year. I don't know what I'm going to do. And so I just got out into parks all the time. And I got back into hiking and got back out into being outdoors, which then led me to having this idea outdoors to do the whole digital nomad thing a couple of years ago. It was in a park that I got the idea to do it. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't have had that had I not been driven from my apartment by the spirit of that specific place that I was living with. And so she did push me to do something fantastic and awesome, which is cool. But I don't envy anybody who ends up getting stuck there, who doesn't end up driving themselves to do something interesting. Because I can see her being extremely like motivating you to try all these specific things and pushing you to do things in not a very nice way. It was very, again, nurturing in a way that pushed me to do cool stuff, but also it was tough. Just like things broke all the time. Just the energy there just felt very like I just couldn't be there. It was an interesting experience. And I think like that was one of the most obvious ones. Depends on the place, certainly. Like I miss my cool little apartment in Asheville that attracted a bunch of bears. I miss when my life was more about trying not to have my face mauled by bears when I was walking around downtown Asheville. That was a fun 3 months. And so that was a good time seeing them all over the place. And the place there just felt easier for the most part too. The place so far that I'm living in Durham it feels like livable, homey, for lack of a better word, which is kind of nice. But nothing really too strong jumps out here. There's not like a strong, very clear characterish kind of sort of presence that I can kind of dive into, which is interesting because that's not always the case. I tend to find pretty interesting characters and stuff no matter where I am. This one doesn't seem to have much of it, which is interesting.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you about how you came to the digital nomad thing, but you kind of answered that. But I'm curious, like, is your plan to stay mostly in the U.S. or do you have plans to take this on the road internationally? Or I guess not always on the road. It might be a boat or a plane.
Boats sound super fun, just not necessarily logistically, unfortunately, for a whole lot of reasons. I'm tied to good Wi-Fi signals for work reasons, and so I can't do a heck of a lot of things that would move me away from that. I had thoughts of potentially going to Italy next year, but I'm not sure if I can make that happen. For the most part, probably sticking stateside, and the eventual plan is to find a place I like enough to settle down in where I can find a tiny-ish house with the larger garden so that I can just live my best life of just writing a bunch of books and stuff and having a small little house to keep me entertained with and those kind of sort of things. But for the most part, the moving around thing is fun, but also it can be it is not all it's cracked up to be. There's a lot of pitfalls with it, and it has been very frustrating the last 6 weeks or so. Again, it depends on the city, and Durham doesn't like me, so I've had very severe problems with my car here. And it's just been like, having the specific lifestyle, I need to have a regular, reliable car. And the night before moving here, my car decided to die on me. So it's been a whole nonstop process, fighting with GM and just like causing all this horrible bad luck for the last month and a half. And it's been quite the process. And so that's kind of losing the luster of things a little bit overall. But it is a really cool experience. I'm grateful for it. And I love to be able to see new places. But finding that settled down place sometime in the next year and a half sounds kind of appealing because I'd like to have a little bit of rest and reprieve from the pressure of trying to find new places too. And also one of the challenges is finding the next place. It never goes easily. It's always just like bashing your head against the wall for a good couple of weeks, trying to make people respond to you on these websites and stuff, trying to get leases out of folks and having the things go through correctly and all that kind of sort of stuff. And it's just it's tough. But again, it's a cool experience, but it's not as seamless maybe as I was hoping it was going to be when I got the idea to start this again a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think there is this like romance to it's like the van life thing, right? It's like, tiny houses, van life, traveling, digital nomad. And it's because what we see from people who are in that experience is the curated part, not I saw this beautiful sunset from my van and then I had to go take a poop in a bucket. It's not quite glamour all the time. But yeah, I can see that. But I think one of the things that was fascinating to me about your book and reading it and thinking about being in that lifestyle and having, how kind of like when you're traveling, your senses are in a different mode than when you kind of are in the routine of your life day to day. So like the fact that you were in this place temporarily connecting with the spirit of the river and Richmond City, and then that your eyes were open to all those synchronicities. Like I think someone could have that same experience who lived there all the time and might not see the things that you saw while you were there.
Yeah, I think it's a really good observation. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this whole lifestyle thing, because it does keep me on my toes in a lot of ways. And it is opening me up to a lot of things. And like, I think one of the nice things about being so adaptable and having so many options all over the place is just being able to follow where the signs and syncs will lead me. And so I deliberately ignored a synchronicity from last week that might have taken me back to Richmond, because I don't want to repeat places so quickly and so soon. But I was walking past somebody on a bike trail after a bunch of nonsense one morning, and just being very frustrated with things not working out in terms of knowing where to go in the next couple of places. And I walked past a woman who said something along the lines of, and she was talking to her friend, like a new path opened up in March in Richmond. And March is when I have to find another place, and Richmond would be an interesting place. I was trying to find a spot in Virginia Beach to go to, but Virginia Beach doesn't seem to want to work out for whatever reason. And so now I'm kind of like, nah, do I play with that and go back to Richmond again? Maybe do a sequel there, who knows? But it doesn't necessarily sound too fun. But I don't want to repeat places so quickly. But yeah, I think being open to those synchronicities and stuff is really kind of fun. And I feel bad for shutting the door on that one, possibly. But who knows? These Virginia places these Virginia Beach places I'm trying to contact now aren't working out. So I might have no choice but to follow through on the Richmond sync.
Yeah.
So we'll see how it goes. But I think the novelty of stuff really does kind of help to inspire and keep me motivated and try to find cool things around me in terms of different cities and things like that. I find one of my favorite places and things to do of all time is just find the botanical gardens in each city and just like spend hours there. And just seeing so many of those has just been amazing. So I've loved that. And that's led to all sorts of fun syncs and things like that too, and different plant friends to get to know. And it's been an interesting process to kind of see all the adaptation and change in my magical practice and starting this up too. Like it's been really refreshing, motivating, and different even compared to how it was 2-3 years ago when I got this all started, for understandable reasons. It does change because you can't necessarily have a lot of stuff with you. So I don't have a lot of things to fall back on in terms of like tools and ritual items that I might have had a couple of years ago. Now I have everything fits in a box, a very, very small box. And so I can't do a heck of a lot in terms of relying on the stuff. So you get very creative, I guess. And it kind of really does focus your practice to go back to the essentials of just focusing on what's around you. I had the best time setting up an altar this week for about a week and a half ago, maybe within the last couple of weeks ago. I'm working on an altar for a specific ritual and stuff that I'm working on. I just had the best time wandering around the parks down here, picking up leaves and wintry sort of things to help bring me into more of a winter focus. And so that was super cool. And I don't think I would have done that back in Buffalo because A, I hate the winters, and B, trying to find stuff down here is quite fun in terms of little naturey paraphernalia, which is cool.
Yeah. Podcast being demanding for some reason. No, that makes sense to me because I do think I think about the times that I've traveled extensively and that somewhat kind of freeing thing of not having all your stuff and realizing you can get along pretty good with just, a backpack full of things for a while. I mean, I am also a creature comforts person. I mean, my husband always jokes. I joke about running off and living in the woods with a yurt and some goats. He's like, and you need 27 pillows to fall asleep. It's like, yeah, it is a bit of a dichotomy. But I do
Those are challenging goals, unfortunately, that do not necessarily, they don't seem to line up too well.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, how do you have your creature comforts also while being a bit of a wanderer about? But it's hard, in our case. We did do a cross-country movie with a cat, which was an adventure, but all the time with a cat, cats are not explorers for the most part in that way.
And they like their routines from what I get. Yeah. That's one of the bad things about the lifestyle too, is that I love pets. I love animals and I really miss having some. But there's just, I would feel bad inflicting my need to move all the time on a cat or a dog. Dogs would be easier. I think lots of people do this with dogs, but a cat I don't think would do. You have to have a very specific personality with a cat to be able to handle this. And so it's a rare personality in a cat. And I don't think I'd be lucky enough to find one who'd be all sorts of adventurous and stuff because they're cool. They're out there.
Yeah, a cat thinks it's a dog, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are you working on now? What's what's on the desktop or whatever now for you?
I've been struggling with what to do next. I kind of started like a potential sequel to the book when I was in Asheville. I had a really cool idea for a part 2 and 3, but the part 2 is kind of falling apart, and I've started reworking another potential idea for the part 2. So I'm just trying to like bring in those spirits of place or whatever that I'm working with, and the specific areas that I'm in to kind of see where things take me. And so I'm working with one right now to really kind of focus me in on winter and how much I dislike it. So I'm really trying to like pick apart the idea of lightness and darkness, which I think I got into a little bit in the first book, at least in terms of wildness and not wildness and those kind of sort of things, and how it works for a lot of folks in the West who might consider themselves separate from nature as a potential theory. And I'm trying to like work with that idea. I feel like that there's a lot of talk around it, I think, for understandable reasons in terms of the separation from nature and that kind of sort of stuff these days as animists and, witches, wizards. And it's an imaginal idea. Like that idea is not an actual, livable fact. And so I feel like we have to really play with that idea in the imaginal realm itself. And so that's why I'm trying to write stories that help kind of deconstruct that idea a little bit. And so I'm trying to like work on that as a project, and lightness and darkness as a potential concept for overreach, I guess, in terms of the specific spirits that I think a lot of folks tend to interact with on the Western history and culture kind of sort of side, and like what that looks like in terms of over reliance on too much lightness versus not enough darkness. And it's a balance as opposed to a one side completely obliterating the other kind of sort of thing. And so just trying to bring in different stories and stuff, I guess, and trying to really like be a massive sponge for myth and stories and those things right now. It's been a cool process just listening to stories and like reading about a lot of other things. And the things for me tend to really pick up around when I do a better job of exposing myself to and taking those stories in. And so if I don't necessarily seek out like legit folktales or myths or stories that involve mythic beings and gods and spirits and those kind of sort of things, the things tend to die down for me. It's definitely very much tied to those kind of sort of stories too. And so I think if I do more of those things, the writing picks back up. And so I'm working on that kind of sort of potential option for parts 2 and 3. We'll see how that goes. I also just try to like get my feet wet with writing all the time, just through short stories and stuff that I publish. I would say regularly, but that's not the case. Maybe every few months these days, but I was doing pretty well with it earlier this year and definitely more so last year. But I can't seem to, I don't know about you, but I'm not great with separating between short story mode versus like novel-ish writing mode. I'm very clear. I'm in short story mode for a few months and I'll have a few published, or it's just very much specifically focusing on this larger project. I don't really do well mixing the two, which is sad from what I've seen.
Yeah, I am purposely working on a nonfiction book and a fiction book at the same time right now, which is I usually just work on one thing at a time and finish it. But my own self-imposed project deadlines have mixed that up a little bit. Yeah, it's difficult to go back and forth for me. It's a mindset kind of thing, but because the nonfiction book I'm working on is very heavily research oriented. There's just a whole different brain space too. Like in addition to like the writing is different, like the mechanics of it are also different.
How do you feel like you're able to take some of the research and stuff that you're working on for the nonfiction project and tie it into the fiction one, or all? Or are you trying to keep them as separate as possible?
Yeah, no, they always bleed. There's always bleed. Because the nonfiction project, a book that just came out, when this comes out, it will have been out for a few months, but there's a lot about art history and painting in it. And so the nonfiction book I'm working on has a lot about actual artists in it. So there's some definite overlap in the research for those. It's been interesting. It's been interesting to kind of, push myself in new directions, because I think, just as a writer, I think it's important to try different things. Like I always kind of compare it to, in some ways painting and visual arts is like, try a different color, try a different media, see what happens. And, that was part of the, impetus for the podcast, is to read a bunch of different, my commitment was to read a book by everybody who came on the show. which has turned into a much bigger commitment than I had anticipated. But it's pushed me and to read stuff I probably wouldn't have read or picked up on my own. So that's been really interesting. And, creating a podcast is very different than writing. Like this is not a scripted podcast because I'm talking to people. So that's been a different experience. There's also a way to flog books, mine and other people's, without actually having to flog them. So
that is the way to do it, I would argue. It makes it a lot easier than having to do the whole self-defeating, soul-crushing marketing social media experience. So I think this is the way to do it. So good job for figuring that out in terms of threading that needle. Well done.
Yeah, it's, what is it? Marketing through content, I guess. And I mean, I can't say that I'm ready to retire on my royalty checks, but they have gotten bigger over time. I mean, I'm not paying rent. I'm not paying California rent, but I'm keeping the lights on for the podcast and stuff like that. So that's good. And we did this year. We stepped out and we were publishing other folks now too, through our tiny publishing house. And that's been a great experience. I mean, it's great to work with authors, and it's been really, exciting. We're doing print on demand, so we don't have the giant print run concerns to worry about, which in some ways are great. And, in some ways it's really nice to be able to send someone a box of books. So it's, we're navigating a lot of different things, but I do think there's a lot to be said for creative control as an author. And that's really something we wanted to give to other people who may not have the resource. Like my husband had worked in publishing before, and kind of like you had the skill set to do it. There's a lot of people who want that creative control. They don't have the skill set to publish. So we wanted to be a publisher that would really, let people have a lot of creative control in the process. And so that's been good for me as an author, to kind of see like what really works for other people too. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like having that as a guiding ethos, I think as a publisher, is not that I have any experience, obviously, working with other publishers and stuff, but I think having that creative control is one of the things that I was definitely leery about getting involved with a publisher myself, because I feel like, the whole thing is a creative exercise for me. And I could do all the things that a publisher can. And I was very hesitant to kind of give that control over to somebody else, just because it's a story that involves, it's for lack of a better pretentious word, it's a bit of a hyper sigil in the sense that it's a creative kind of sort of project that tries to involve my narrative and stuff. And it felt a little weird for me to potentially give that over to a publisher. If it had been like a totally new creator, totally new character that is not related to my specific spiritual aura, overall being, or whatever, that would be one thing. But this one's felt like it had to be a self-published kind of sort of project. But I can see having that as an option in terms of creative control and potential options and stuff for other projects being really, really cool and welcoming for a lot of folks. It's even just like from the very outside tangential kind of sort of stuff that I saw, it does seem like there's a lot of really cool witchy-ish publishers out there these days doing a lot of stuff around those creative control pieces, which is cool to see. And so I think there's a really good renaissance happening now. Renaissance, lack of a better word, in terms of light and stuff, all that kind of sort of thing too. But I feel like there's a lot of good stuff going on these days in terms of the general witchy sector, which is nice.
Yeah. And I do think it's interesting because it's already a niche, right? In publishing, like even though Simon & Schuster publishes, witchcraft and spirituality books and all that stuff, it's still a tiny niche in their publishing world. And, and the big pagan publishers are still relatively small presses. Like Llewellyn is probably the biggest one, followed closely by Weiser, and they're still really small compared to, Penguin, Random House. Although I still maintain that they missed the opportunity to be Random Penguin, but it would have been such a better name.
It would have been fun.
Yeah,
very missed opportunity. How sad.
So I think and then you have all these like boutique publishers in this kind of space, in this occult space. You hear it in the UK and other places. So I think you're right. It is kind of an embarrassment of riches, golden age, whatever, to do that, even in our kind of our niche publishing. But it's fascinating to me, like the different, because especially this proliferation of publishing houses doing really beautiful, like fine editions of things. Like if that's your jam, is a good time to be a book collector. So
I do miss that that's another digital nomad bad side of the double-edged sword. I miss having books. Everything that I have is on Kindle these days, my e-reader stuff, because I just can't afford to cart around 1,000 books in another giant bin or whatever. So I had to get rid of a lot of them, which is sad. And so there's so many cool, like you said, collector's editions out there that I would just, it'd be fun to have them somewhere, but I just can't. So I have to have them on ebook version or whatever, which is unfortunate. But one of the things that I find kind of interesting too is that one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because I don't feel like there's a lot of occulty, witchy fiction stuff out there. And so there's a whole lot of nonfiction stuff, which is great. Love to see it. But there aren't a lot of people telling their stories, I suppose, fiction wise, from what or at least there might be. I just haven't found a way to find them more easily. But I know I see lots of nonfiction stuff all the time, but I'd love to see more authors putting out more fictiony, occulty, witchy kind of sort of stuff. And I tried to write the book. I've always kind of like wanted to write a novel. And this is a short one, certainly, but I wanted to always kind of like write something that was like, if from like a 0 to 10 kind of sort of scale in terms of magical happenings, if our current reality is like a 5, what would like a 6 or a 7 maybe be? Whereas like 10 is just utterly bonkers, Harry Potter kind of sort of reality where people are like whipping around spells all over the place. 5, 6, or a 7 is just slightly more magical, recognizing there is some magic in our reality, which is why it's a 5. So I try to write it from that kind of perspective. And I feel like I love those kinds of stories that interact with mythic beings, spirits, and gods, and those kind of sort of things. American Gods is one of my favorites. It's great. All sorts of stories that interact with those specific beings and history and stuff is cool. I want to see more of that. And so I guess I kind of wrote the book that I wanted to kind of see, which is always a fun project, I'm sure. But I'd love to see more of that stuff. And it's coming from a self-published perspective. It's certainly, I had that skill set in my back pocket, but there are ways to make it happen for everybody. Just kind of like to check that goal off your list or whatever of just publishing that novel the first time, to get these books out there about fiction stories and stories, fiction stories and stories you want to kind of write for whatever reason about more witchy or occult things. Again, I feel like it's a pretty big miss that I'm not seeing a lot of. I'm not sure if you're seeing that too, but I feel like it's a lot of nonfiction stuff.
I think there's a lot. I think witches are hot in fiction, but I think a lot of people who are writing fiction about witches are not themselves magical practitioners. So I think there are magical practitioners writing about witchcraft, mostly on that 10 scale. I think there have been some interesting books lately that kind of pull it in a little bit, and it's more like a 5 or 6, kind of where we are, like this is what real magic look like, or this is what magic would look like with just a little extra, not quite CGI, but maybe just a little tweak. So I think it's there. I think it's not, it's coming from smaller presses. It's coming, like from people who are publishing themselves, but I think it's there. And I think it's maybe finding its community. Like, I don't have my finger on the pulse of that as much as like just the existence of it. And my stuff is about witches, and there's 5 magic, and then there's also 10 magic in mine. So there's like, this is what real witches do, and this is what real witches do when they have CGI at their disposal. So I think, my stuff is kind of on that scale, but yeah, it's interesting. Like I have a harder time getting fiction authors on the show than I do nonfiction authors. Part of that is just how PR works too. Like, I think that's part of it. And I've been excited to have a couple poets on or scheduled. So that's kind of nice too. Cause there's people doing all kinds of interesting stuff. And yeah, it's been one of the nice things about the podcast, honestly.
I'll have to pick your brain later then about potential recommendations for 5, 6, 7 level books. Cause again, I want to see those things. I'd love to kind of see more of them. And I think my problem just might be I'm not looking hard enough. And also like just the term that I've kind of found a lot of the time is the magical realism sort of thing. And that seems a really good keyword, but I just find myself tripping over the same like list of 20 books. And they're all great, but I've read them all. And so I need more. That's the issue.
I think magical realism has a literary aspect to it too. Like you think a lot about like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and a lot of like Eastern European writers, and that kind of magical realism, I think, in literature came out of South America and Eastern Europe, partly for subversion purposes, honestly, around the political situations. But but I think there's like a realistic magic. We don't quite have a genre term for that yet. So.
That's true. Funny you should mention that. I feel I'm in the middle of reading 100 Years of Solitude, and I loved Master and Margarita. I think I read that in like the spring of 2021. And again, kind of like that book was hilarious at points and just also really cool and very subversive from a lot of reasons too. And I try to kind of like go that route-ish. Not that I can compare myself to that, really cool little literary masterpiece. But I kind of had that sort of in the back of my head in terms of characters and spirits to kind of bring in into the book that I was writing, because I love that stuff. And it is out there, but I think it is it does seem to be the observation that it's very subversive and political is a really good point too. And I feel like there is a lot of involvement of that kind of sort of sphere in this like upcoming like witchy sort of push, I would assume, just because I think that so many people are just out there realizing how much needs to be done, how much work there is left to do. And so I feel like it would be a great thing to kind of involve that stuff in the works coming out next.
It's funny that you mentioned American Gods, because so the podcast is kind of a family affair, because my husband does all the tech stuff. My son edits the episodes, and then my daughter-in-law edits the transcripts. So we've joked about the fact that Neil Gaiman is the free space in the middle of the WitchLit bingo card, because his name comes up on every episode. So thank you for getting the bingo for today.
You're welcome. Happy to help.
Like, because I feel like a lot of Neil Gaiman stuff is really, because so much of it's informed by folklore and mythology. Like, I feel like he's just a natural kind of locus for people to talk about this kind of writing, and he's probably the most famous living writer in this space, I guess. So
yeah, absolutely. I feel like I think lots of people who are witchy, occulty, whatever, tend to really enjoy him. I think a lot of us wish like he were more on our side in terms of like magical beliefs and stuff. Not that I have a whole primer on like what goes on in Neil Gaiman's head, but I haven't heard that he's like, I don't think he tends to think in an animist way from what I've heard. But who knows? But I feel like there's a lot of us who just love the works that he's done and can use them is the wrong word, can really enjoy reading them and just really kind of like take them in for inspiration. And there's every single book that I read by him is just enjoyable and fun too, which is crazy. And I feel like there's very few writers that I just really enjoy the books that I read from them. And I tend to not be the kind of person that goes back to authors repeatedly. I like to read as much as I can from different people. But whenever I go back to a Neil Gaiman pick, it's always like, oh, this one's really good too. And I feel so cliche for liking it so much, but they're always so great.
Yeah. And they're different. I mean, they're different. Like, American Gods is very different than Ocean at the End of the Lane. Those are very different books, but they do interesting things. They both do interesting things. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting about now going back to them. I tend to be a completist when I find a writer I like I'll just read everything I can get my hands on. So
that's I feel bad because I feel like I should, because that would probably help my reading list feel a bit more, I don't want to say comprehensive or well-rounded or whatever, but I feel like I should pick and choose more people to kind of stick with, because I tend to dart around perhaps too much. I just finished reading, I forgot the book, but Octavia Butler, Wild Seeds, maybe?
Oh, yeah. The parable books, the parable of the sower and the parable.
Yes. Yeah. I think I think the one that I read is called Wild Seed or whatever. I think it's like a prequel that was written after the fact. It was awesome. I loved it. And now I have to add the rest of those to my to-read list. But I just get very frustrated because my to-read list is always too long. So I just love that one, but I'm gonna have to go back and finish up the rest of them later on.
I will say the parable of the sower is a heavy read right now. But it's brilliant. She was brilliant. And I've heard in interviews, she did not think of herself as prophetic. She was just extrapolating on the current situation when she was writing. She didn't really see it as prophetic, just, expanding on what was going on at the time. So I think it's pretty interesting. But yeah. So we try to keep it to an hour here. We're not great at that, obviously. But I did want, before we do our game of chance question, I want to give you an opportunity to kind of tell people where to find your book and more about your work, and you, if you want people to find that, and then we'll do our little game of chance.
Sounds good. So everything can be found. I have a website, which is themadhabitator.com. The play on the Mad Hatter, but with the word habitat thrown in there. And so that's kind of what the book is titled to. It's called The Mad Habitator, Wild Gods in Richmond. You can find me on Instagram, though I'm not great about that these days in terms of posting things because social media is hellscapes everywhere. And so I'm trying to reduce my use there. Even though it would be a helpful marketing tool, I'm not great at that either. But also most of my pictures on Instagram are just like me posting pretty pictures of flowers. And now I'm doing like nature video, music video montages with like synth pop and synth rock songs. So the juxtaposition is bonkersly ridiculous, but it's a fun time. So I just did one for Durham. I had one for Asheville a couple of weeks ago with Hemlock Springs, and this most recent one was a fun little thing too. So I'm not great about social media, and what I post there isn't necessarily very indicative of what the other stuff that I'm up to is. But yeah, the book is The Mad Habitator, Wild Gods in Richmond. The website is themadhabitator.com, and I put short stories up there occasionally, some poems and stuff too. But also is pretty much a funnel for my photography at the moment, and so I've kind of like really taken my photography out of Instagram and try to put it on a website, more of a portfolio sort of thing. It tends to be more of a visual story representation of the cities that I'm in, rather than just me trying to hawk that stuff on the gram these days.
That's good. Cool. So you've listened to a couple episodes, you know kind of how this works at the end. So I will roll a die, and depending on what number I get, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which one you want. So, and you can pass 2. The 3, religion. We're good.
Sounds good.
So one of the things I thought was interesting in the book is the character that is you ostensibly talks about praying the rosary, like while you're walking around. So obviously Catholic upbringing. And then the book is really about encountering wild gods, one of whom is who I would call the witch's devil or the man in black, which is not someone necessarily welcome in Catholic spaces. So how do you take that personal experience and your kind of your understanding of the world, and how do you navigate those things that don't always necessarily go together?
I tend to approach it with a lens that goes back into the whole animist mindset kind of sort of thing. I believe that both of those specific spirits have their own agency and they're kind of working things through in their own ways. Also, from what my understanding is too, like witches back in the day, especially like English witches and witches back in older European times, had a relationship with the devil and Mary at the same time too, and Jesus and all the Christian kind of sort of trappings and spirits and all that kind of sort of stuff. He was more, I wouldn't say welcomed, but worked with, maybe partnered with in specific situations and whenever you kind of like wanted to kind of keep him at arm's length. And the story for me too is also recognizing that like this wild god that I kind of experienced in Richmond wants to interact with humanity in a very specific way around stories and just reintroducing humanity to the quote unquote wild or natural world. And I feel like that's not necessarily something that a lot of the Christian spirits would be opposed to. And so I try to square it in that way, I suppose, in the sense that it's really trying to care for, bring ourselves back into relationship with the places around us, the spirits around us, the plants and the animals around us, all that kind of sort of stuff, and more of a way that removes the idea of wildness as being separate from humanity. But also trying to just make sure that we have that sort of love for all these specific spirits and stuff in place. And with the rosary prayer too, like a lot of that tends to deal with roses and that kind of sort of plant when it comes with Mary, and like Mary and Lucifer tend to have quite a overlapping relationship too. And even like the book kind of talks about how trying to get to know these specific spirits can be very confusing because there's so much more overlap once you kind of get into the whole historical and folklore kind of background of a lot of them. And so both Mary and Lucifer are associated with the planet Venus and the 5-pointed star kind of sort of thing. And there is a lot of weird overlap between the two of those. They were both called Morning Star at some point potentially. And so I feel like there's a relationship there too, a distant one, I'm sure, in terms of like how they all interact together. They're separate stories, certainly, but there's at least some sort of overlap there. So that helps a little bit too. But also just being as open to whatever experiences as I can be. I think like the rosary stuff in particular for me was really connecting with my half of my heritage, which is Italian, and just recognizing that, plenty of my ancestors for the longest time prayed the rosary in times of need and that kind of sort of stuff. And it's trying to connect with that. And then maybe the witch's devil is me trying to connect with the ancestors who might have been around and more interested in spirits of place and wildness before Christianity, and just trying to maybe be the bridge to bring the two of those together wherever possible.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I thought was interesting thinking about like kind of, interacting with the natural world, however you want to. I mean, I think there's the whole conversation we had about saying nature is something separate from us because we're all, whatever. But that, we have this culturally, this idea, like, great, like when you see a beautiful sunset or the beach, this is, God's creation, this beautiful thing. But the scary things we attribute to a sense of darkness, whether that's Satan, the devil, whatever. And I think about that, like, even in like, this came up because I had a recent discussion about Roger J. Horn's The Witch's Devil's book. And like we called like plants that were poisonous were often called the devil's something. Or if they smelled bad, they were just plants of the devil. Or like places in the world that like maybe have a weirdness to them, whether that's a liminality or it's dangerous place, like Devil's Tower, Devil's, like we call those things, even though they're all part of the same spectrum of the natural world. And I just thought it was interesting in your book to kind of have that juxtaposition and that spirit of place really represented in this very kind of physical character that the main character interacts with, whatever they may actually be. So
I think it's a really important point for us to kind of settle in terms of humanity these days, because we don't, as I kind of talked about before too, like there needs to be a balance between the light and the dark. And so I feel like we can't constantly, and I feel like our culture is very obsessed with lights and light beings and all these specific white focus things around like the color of light and all that kind of sort of stuff. And while demonizing in a whole lot of very dangerous ways, the darkness, black things, all that kind of sort of stuff. And it's even gone, that's the root of racism in a lot of ways too, is this idea of purity and the danger with turning away from the light and the color of whiteness versus blackness and stuff. That has a lot of roots where a lot of the very, very horrible things that kind of came out of Western history over the last, 500-600 years have roots in this specific dichotomy. I don't feel like as a culture, we are doing a very good job at trying to bring the two of them together. We keep them very separate in terms of storytelling and stuff. And so I really want to explore that. That's what I'm kind of working on now, is like trying to piece that together, try to be that being, that person, like I think a lot of other occulty witchy folks are, that walks the line between those two things. It isn't trying to focus only on the light and the whiteness and the, these separate heavenly kind of sort of realms, when there's so much cool stuff here that we're surrounded by, that I feel like we really could be transitioning our spaces around us into like lovely gardens and stuff. But so many people are so focused on trying to ascend to this like separate heavenly realm in the sky. And again, that comes from like a very interesting mythical motif around sky gods in the Mediterranean, who are storm gods and stuff, that tended to be very monotheistic and dangerous in terms of what their eventual stories turned out to be. And so I feel like that is really cool thing that a lot of us witches and occult folks are kind of like working on these days in terms of a project, trying to recontextualize all those stories into something more useful for humanity now.
Yeah, I like that approach. Oh, well, I'm excited to see where part 2 takes you physically and as a book. So.
Me too. Can't wait to find out where it's going to be myself. We're looking forward to all the moves the next couple of months. It's going to be fun.
Awesome. Well, and thank you so much for your time. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for reaching out about being on the show. Plug again to people if you're interested. Email me, message me on Instagram, and let's keep in touch. Sounds good.
Sounds great. Thank you. As a quick plug too, you made it very, very easy, Victoria. So anybody who might be a little intimidated, it's been a fantastic and easy process. And so anybody who would want to and is working on their own book, by all means, reach out to Victoria. She's been awesome in terms of setting this stuff up. So don't be afraid. It's been a great process.
Awesome. Thank you. WitchLit is a production of 1000 Volt Press and is edited by Julian Rashke. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew Kay, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shenekar. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Threads at witchlitpod. Please help other witches find us by leaving a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to and reading WitchLit.